Hello dear listeners and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here. So glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special, and of course do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable. The mystery awaits. Chapter 1. What the fog gave up. The storm that struck Loch Dubh on the last Thursday of October arrived without the usual courtesy of a warning. In the Highlands, the weather is generally considered to have manners. It grumbles in grey skies and mutters to itself for days before doing anything dramatic. This particular storm, however, had apparently been raised without benefit of good breeding. It came screaming down from the north in the small hours, rattling the windows of every cottage along the waterfront, hurling the loch into white-crested fury, and tearing away a considerable portion of the old coastal path that ran behind the village toward the derelict peat-cutting ground known locally as Scormore. Hamish Macbeth slept through the worst of it. This was not owing to any remarkable quality of sleep on his part, but rather to the fact that his dog Lugs, a large floppy-eared mongrel of no particular distinction but considerable personal presence, had wedged himself firmly against the small of Hamish's back sometime around midnight, creating a warmth that no gale in Scotland could reasonably overcome. Hamish had stirred once, registered that it was very loud outside, and had gone back to sleep with the pragmatic calm of a man who has long since made his peace with Highland weather. By morning the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind that peculiar washed silence that follows great violence. The sky was pale and thin as skimmed milk. Loch Dubh itself sat quiet under a low coastal fog that lay in ragged drifts along the shore, softening the edges of the fishing boats and the white-painted cottages and the church with its small, perpetually damp graveyard. Hamish was at the stove making porridge when P.C. Willie Lamont arrived at the police station door, which was also the kitchen door, which was in fact the only door anyone ever used. Willie was a former policeman turned restaurant owner who still occasionally attached himself to Hamish's investigations, out of a combination of boredom and nosiness that Hamish had long ago given up trying to discourage. "There is a skeleton on the shore," said Willie without preamble. Hamish stirred his porridge. "Aye," he said. "Did you hear me? A skeleton, human, sticking out of the bank down past the peat ground." "I heard you fine." Hamish turned from the stove and regarded Willie with his pale grey eyes. "I'll be along in a moment. Have you called it in? I thought you'd want to see it first." "That is the kind of helpful thinking," said Hamish, reaching for his cap. "That warms my heart and chills my career simultaneously." He rang it in himself, briefly and accurately, and then pulled on his waterproof and walked with Willie down toward the shore, Lugs trotting ahead of them with the purposeful air of a dog who suspects something interesting is about to happen. The coastal path behind Scormore had indeed taken a battering. A section of the bank, perhaps 12 feet in length, had sheared away during the night, exposing a deep raw cut of dark peaty earth and the tangled roots of long-dead heather. The fog clung in threads to the exposed ground, and there, half emerged from the dark earth, like something that had been waiting a very long time for the right moment, were bones. They were unmistakably human, a section of rib cage, the curve of a shoulder, and just above, grinning with the universal cheerfulness of the long dead, most of a skull. Hamish crouched and studied what he could see without touching anything. The bones were dark with peat staining, which meant they had been here for years, decades possibly. Beside the exposed rib cage, where the ground had fractured and separated, a rusted tin box had been pushed part way to the surface by the same forces that had freed the bones. Its lid was buckled but still attached. Hamish could see the edge of what appeared to be paper just visible at the rim. "Do not touch that box," he said, largely to Willie, who'd been edging toward it with an expression of intense curiosity. "I wasn't going to touch it," said Willie, who clearly had been. By the time Hamish had cordoned off the area with the tape he kept in his jacket pocket, a habit born of long experience in a village where the population treated crime scenes as social occasions, a small group of villagers had materialized from the fog with the collective instinct of people who have nothing urgent to do and every reason to be interested in something that does not concern them. Jessie Crawford from the post office was there in her yellow waterproof, her arms folded in a manner that suggested she had already formed a complete theory. Old Davy Sutherland, who had lived in Loch Dubh for 81 years and regarded novelty with deep suspicion, stood a little apart, leaning on his stick. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, had arrived with the expression of a woman who considers herself professionally relevant at moments of community distress. Hamish watched their faces. He had learned, over many years in Lochdu, that faces told you things that mouths were far too careful to say. Most of the assembled villagers showed what he expected: curiosity, a little excitement, the particular pleasure of something to discuss over dinner. But a few of the older ones, Davy Sutherland and Morag Finlayson, who ran the wool shop, and old Angus Moore, who had retired from his croft at the south end of the village, showed something else, not shock, not curiosity, something flatter and older and considerably more complicated. They were not surprised. Hamish filed that observation away in the careful, untidy mental drawer he kept, for things he didn't yet know what to do with. It was Mrs. Wellington who spoke first, as Mrs. Wellington generally did. "That poor soul," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who enjoys a tragedy provided it has nothing to do with them personally. "How long do you suppose they've been there, Hamish?" "I couldn't say at this point," said Hamish. The fog shifted, and a thin shaft of morning light fell across the exposed bank. Hamish glanced again at the tin box and then at the faces around him. Davy Sutherland had turned away. Morag Finlayson was studying her boots with unnecessary intensity, and old Angus Moore, who under normal circumstances would have inserted himself into any conversation going, said nothing at all. It was Jessie Crawford who said the name. She said it quietly, almost to herself, as though she had not quite meant to say it aloud. "Catriona," she murmured. "It'll be Catriona Drummond." The name fell into the fog like a stone into water. A ripple passed through the older faces. No one contradicted her. No one agreed. The silence that followed was the specific and unmistakable silence of people who have been waiting 30 years to hear a name spoken, and are not entirely sure how they feel now that someone has finally said it. Hamish looked at Jessie. "What makes you say that?" Jessie pulled her waterproof tighter. "Just a thought," she said, and looked away at the loch. "Aye," said Hamish softly, "just a thought." He turned back to the bones in the dark earth and the rusted tin box with its patient cargo of paper and silence, and he thought that in Lochdu, just as in most small Highland villages, the things people chose not to say were almost always more interesting than the things they did. The forensics team from Inverness would come, and the detective inspector would come, and there would be forms and photographs and the whole apparatus of official investigation. But Hamish Macbeth, who had been the constable of Lochdu for more years than he cared to precisely count, and who knew every stone and secret of the place, understood already that the real work was not going to be done by any of that. The real work was going to be done in kitchens and sitting rooms, and the dark corners of old memory, where the truth had been quietly living all this time, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Lugg sat down beside him and leaned against his leg. The fog rolled in off the loch, and Lochdub kept its silence a little longer. Chapter 2. The Story That Never Sat Right. The detective inspector who arrived from Inverness that afternoon was a man named Blair, whom Hamish knew slightly and disliked considerably. Blair had the particular quality, common to certain middle-ranking police officials, of being simultaneously lazy and ambitious, a combination that expressed itself in a willingness to accept the easiest explanation for everything while taking full credit for its discovery. He stood at the edge of the cordoned area, hands in his pockets, and regarded the exposed bones with the expression of a man who has already made up his mind, and is merely waiting for everyone else to catch up. "Old case," he said. "Decades. Likely accidental. Not much to be done at this stage." "There's a tin box," said Hamish. "Aye, I see the tin box." "It appears to contain letters." "Personal effects," said Blair. "Common enough. Doesn't signify anything criminal." He pulled his coat tighter against the wind. "Any idea who it might be?" "The locals have mentioned a name," said Hamish carefully. "Catriona Drummond. She disappeared sometime in the late 90s. Blair's expression shifted slightly, as though he were performing a calculation involving the minimum amount of work required. "Reported missing, was she?" "I'd have to check the records." "Do that. If she was a runaway or similar, we'll have the answer soon enough. Dental records, if we're lucky. DNA, if necessary, though that takes time." Blair turned from the bones with the air of a man who has discharged his duty. "Keep an eye on things until the forensics lads are finished. Shouldn't take more than a day or two." He left in his car, trailing exhaust and indifference in equal measure. Hamish stood alone in the grey afternoon and considered the various ways in which Blair was going to be unhelpful. Then he walked back to the police station and went in search of the old case files. The filing system at Lochdu police station operated on a principle best described as archaeological. The oldest records were kept in a series of boxes in what had once been a coal cellar and was now a damp storage room that smelled of mildew and disappointment. Hamish descended the narrow stairs with a torch and a growing sense that he was about to confirm something he already suspected. The box for the late 90s was wedged between a broken typewriter and several cartons of outdated forms. Inside, organised with the careful precision of someone who took their work seriously, were incident reports, case notes, and correspondence dating back to 1995. He found the file on Katrina Drummond on his third pass through the box. It was thin, remarkably thin. A missing person report dated the 14th of November 1997, filed by one Margaret Drummond, mother, age of missing person 22, last seen, the evening of November 10th. Distinguishing features: red hair, green eyes, approximately 5'4", and that was essentially all. There was a single follow-up report, dated a week later, noting that inquiries had been made in the village and that several residents reported that Katrina had been talking about leaving Lochdu, possibly for Glasgow or Edinburgh. No evidence of foul play, file closed pending further information. The investigating officer's name was given as Constable J. MacLeod. Hamish sat back on his heels and read the file twice more, looking for what wasn't there. No witness statements, no list of persons interviewed, no indication that anyone had searched for her or pressed the matter, or treated her disappearance as anything other than a tiresome administrative detail. He climbed back upstairs, made himself tea, and telephoned the number listed for the retired constabulary in Strathbane. It took 3 transfers and 20 minutes of hold music before he was connected to a woman named Moira, who handled personnel records. J. MacLeod, said Hamish. James, I'm guessing, or possibly John, constable in Lochdu in the late 90s. There was the sound of typing. John MacLeod, retired in 2003, still living as far as we know. I can give you his last known address. I'd be grateful. The address was in Dornoch, which was an hour's drive north. Hamish noted it down, finished his tea, and decided that the afternoon was not yet too far advanced for a visit. He left a note for Willie in case anyone came looking for him, put lugs in the Land Rover and drove north through the pale afternoon light. John MacLeod lived in a neat bungalow on the edge of Dornoch, with a well-tended garden and a view of the Firth. He answered the door in carpet slippers and a cardigan, and looked at Hamish with the wary expression of a man who knows why a policeman has come to call, and wishes he didn't. "Mr. MacLeod," said Hamish. "I'm PC Macbeth, Lochdu. I'm hoping you might spare me a few minutes." MacLeod's face tightened. "I'm retired." "Aye, I know. This is about an old case. Katrina Drummond, 1997. For a moment, Hamish thought the man might simply close the door. Then MacLeod sighed and stepped back. "You'd better come in." The sitting room was tidy and impersonal in the way of houses occupied by people who have stopped expecting visitors. MacLeod gestured Hamish to a chair but did not sit down himself. He stood by the window looking out at his garden. "They found her then," he said. "We believe so. The storm last night exposed remains at Scoremore." MacLeod was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I told them at the time. I said it didn't sit right." "What didn't sit right?" "The whole business." MacLeod turned from the window. He looked older than his years, and tired in a way that went beyond the physical. "The girl's mother came to me desperate, said Katrina would never have left without a word, never have left her alone like that, and the mother was right. I knew it even then." "The file says you closed the case." "The file says what I was told to write." MacLeod's voice was flat. "I was a constable, Mr. Macbeth, not a detective, and I was given to understand that certain people in Lochdu did not want the matter pursued, that the girl had made enemies or caused trouble, and that everyone would be better served by letting her go quietly." "Who told you that?" "My sergeant, who'd been told by someone higher up, who'd been told by God knows who. It's the Highlands, Mr. Macbeth. You know how it works. Someone important wants something done, or not done, and it happens, or doesn't happen." Hamish leaned forward. "Did you believe she'd run away?" MacLeod laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No. I interviewed 6 people. The stories didn't match. One said she'd been planning to leave for months. Another said she'd been frightened of something. A third said she'd been in an argument with someone but wouldn't say who. It was like everyone had agreed to tell me different things, so long as none of them were the truth. Do you remember who you spoke to? Some of them. Angus Moore, the old crofter. He told me she'd been talking about going to Glasgow, but his eyes were all over the place when he said it. Jessie Crawford. She ran the post office then too. She said Katrina had been troubled but wouldn't elaborate, and there was a young lad, must be middle-aged now, name of Robert Gillies. He was sweet on her, I think. He wouldn't speak to me at all, just turned away when I tried to ask him questions. Hamish made notes. Anyone else? MacLeod rubbed his face. A woman named Morag Finlayson. She said Katrina had secrets. Wouldn't say what kind. And there was talk, just talk, mind you, that Katrina had found out something she shouldn't have. Something about money or property or an old wrong. I tried to follow that up, but every door I knocked on closed in my face. And you were told to let it drop? I was told, said MacLeod quietly, that pursuing the matter would not be good for my career, or for the peace of the village. And I was young, and I had a wife, and I told myself that maybe the girl had run away after all. People do, don't they? They run away from small places and complicated lives, and sometimes they don't come back. But you didn't believe it? No, MacLeod met Hamish's eyes. I didn't believe it. And I've thought about it every year since. Wondered if I'd done the right thing. Wondered if I'd been a coward. And now you're here, and I know the answer to that. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the light was beginning to fade. One more question, said Hamish. Who was the sergeant who told you to close the case? Name was Fraser. Duncan Fraser. He's dead now. Heart attack 6 or 7 years ago. Hamish stood. Thank you for your time, Mr. MacLeod. MacLeod walked him to the door. Will you find out what happened? I'll try. Good. MacLeod's voice was rough. Someone should have tried 28 years ago. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub through the gathering dusk, with Lugs asleep on the passenger seat, and his mind turning over the pieces of a story that had been carefully dismantled before it could be told. A case closed too quickly. Memories that didn't match, and underneath it all, the suggestion of something that someone had wanted to keep hidden, badly enough to lean on a young constable and ensure the matter was buried. Not buried well enough, as it turned out, but then, the earth had its own way of settling old accounts. By the time he pulled up outside the police station, the fog was rolling in again off the loch, and Lochdoub lay quiet under the first stars. Hamish sat in the Land Rover for a moment, looking at the village he had called home for so many years, and he thought about the space between what people said and what they knew, and how sometimes that space could hold a body for nearly 30 years. Then he went inside, fed Lugs, and began to make a list of everyone in Lochdoub who had been there in 1997 and was still alive to remember. It was going to be a long list, and not everyone on it, he suspected, was going to be pleased to see him coming. Chapter 3. The Children Who Grew Up. The forensics team from Inverness worked through the following day with the methodical cheerfulness of people who spend their professional lives in the company of the dead. They erected a small tent over the exposed bank, took photographs from every conceivable angle, and carefully extracted both the bones and the rusted tin box. By late afternoon they had packed up their equipment and departed, leaving behind only the trampled grass and the lingering sense that something had been taken away that could never quite be returned. Hamish watched them go, then walked down to the shore himself. The tin box, he had been informed, was being sent to the lab for careful opening and preservation of its contents. The bones would be examined, measured, and compared against dental records if any could be found. All of which would take time, bureaucracy being a force more powerful than death and considerably more patient. In the meantime, Hamish had his list. It contained 23 names, everyone who had lived in Lochdoub in 1997 and was still resident in the village, or near enough to matter. Some were elderly now, their memories likely to be unreliable or self-serving. Others had been children or teenagers at the time, which made them potentially more interesting. Children, in Hamish's experience, noticed things that adults were too busy or too complicit to see. He began with Robert Gillies. Gillies ran a small building supplies business on the Strathbane Road, a tidy operation with a yard full of timber and a modest showroom that smelled of sawdust and varnish. He was 47 now, according to Hamish's notes, which would have made him 19 in 1997. The young man who had been sweet on Katrina Drummond and had refused to speak to Constable MacLeod. Hamish found him in the yard checking an order against a clipboard. Gillies was a compact man with thinning sandy hair and the careful, economical movements of someone who had learned not to waste effort. He looked up as Hamish approached, and something shifted in his face. Not quite fear, but a closing down, a retreat behind defensive walls. "Mr. Gillies," said Hamish, "I'm PC Macbeth. I wonder if I might have a word." "I'm busy." "It won't take long." Gillies set down his clipboard. "It's about the bones." "It is. I don't know anything about it." "I haven't asked you anything yet," said Hamish mildly. They stood in the yard with the wind moving through the stacked timber. Finally Gillies said, "What do you want to know?" "You knew Katrina Drummond." "Everyone knew Katrina. You knew her particularly, I'm told." Gillies's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long that you've forgotten. I was 19. She was bonny. Half the lads in the village were daft about her. Doesn't mean I know what happened." "What do you remember about the time she disappeared?" "Nothing. She was there one day, gone the next. People said she'd run off." Gillies picked up his clipboard again, a gesture that clearly signified the end of the conversation. "That's all I know." "You didn't find it strange? A girl you cared about vanishing without a word?" "I didn't say I cared about her." "You didn't have to," said Hamish. "It's written all over you even now." Gillies's knuckles whitened on the clipboard. "Leave it alone, Constable." "I'm afraid I can't do that." "Then you're a fool." Gillies turned away. "Just like she was." Hamish let him go. There was no profit in pushing a man who had spent nearly 30 years building walls. But he noted the bitterness in Gillies' voice, and the way his hands had trembled, and the fact that he had called Katrina foolish rather than unlucky. His next stop was the Lochdoub Primary School, where a woman named Fiona Kennedy taught the upper years. She had been Fiona Macpherson in 1997, age 15, and according to MacLeod's fragmentary notes, she had been seen talking to Katrina in the week before the disappearance. He found her in her classroom after the children had gone home, marking papers at her desk. She was a pleasant-faced woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the patient air of someone accustomed to explaining things to people who weren't listening. "Mrs. Kennedy," said Hamish, "I'm sorry to disturb you." She looked up. "You're here about Katrina Drummond. News travels fast. It's Lochdoub. News travels at the speed of gossip, which is somewhere between light and sound." She set down her pen. "I've been expecting someone to come round. Sit down, Constable. I'll tell you what I remember." Hamish sat in a student's chair that was slightly too small for him. "What do you remember?" Fiona Kennedy was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts with the methodical care of a teacher accustomed to clarity. "I was 15. Katrina was 22. She worked at the hotel, serving meals, cleaning rooms. She was kind to me. Used to let me sit in the staff room sometimes when my mother and I had been fighting, which was often at that age." "Did she seem troubled? Frightened?" "Not frightened. Not exactly. But sad. Maybe. Or burdened." Fiona frowned. "A week before she disappeared, I saw her crying by the loch. I asked what was wrong, and she said she'd found out something terrible about someone she'd thought she could trust. She wouldn't tell me what, or who, just said that some people weren't what they seemed." "Did she mention leaving, going away?" "No. She said she had to decide what to do, whether to speak up or stay quiet. She said staying quiet would be easier, but not right." Fiona's expression darkened. "And then she was gone, and everyone said she'd run off, and I wanted to believe it. But I didn't. I don't think she ran, Constable. I think someone made sure she couldn't speak up." "Did you tell anyone this at the time?" "I tried. I told my mother, who told me not to make trouble. I told the constable, MacLeod his name was, but he just nodded and wrote something down and nothing came of it. After a while I stopped trying. You learn to do that in small places. You learn when to stop pushing." Hamish thanked her and left, adding her testimony to the growing weight of evidence that Katrina Drummond had known something dangerous and had been silenced for it. The third interview of the day was less productive. Donald Murray ran a small farm at the north end of the village and had been 25 in 1997. He claimed to remember nothing. Not about Katrina, not about her disappearance, not about anything at all. His face was closed and hostile, and when Hamish pressed him, he simply walked away and left Hamish standing in the yard. It was getting dark by the time Hamish returned to the village proper. He stopped at the Napoli, the Italian restaurant that Willie Lamont ran with his wife, and sat at the bar nursing a whisky while Willie pretended not to hover. "How's the investigation going?" said Willie eventually. Slowly. "Everyone either remembers nothing or remembers carefully edited versions of nothing. That's the Highlands for you. We're very good at selective amnesia." Hamish swirled his whisky. 3 people so far. Robert Gillies, who was sweet on her and is bitter about it still, Fiona Kennedy, who says Katrina discovered something terrible about someone, and Donald Murray, who won't talk at all, which is interesting in itself. There's your man, then, the one who won't talk. Or he's just a bad-tempered crofter who doesn't like policemen. Hard to say. Hamish finished his drink. What do you remember about it, Willie? You would have been here in 97. Willie wiped the bar with unnecessary thoroughness. I was working in Glasgow then, came back in 2000. Convenient? Not really. Glasgow was terrible. Willie set down his cloth. But I'll tell you what I heard when I came back. People said the girl had been wild, that she'd got herself into trouble, that she'd been seeing someone she shouldn't have been seeing. Take your pick of stories. They all end the same way. She brought it on herself. They always do, said Hamish quietly. Funny how often the stories that blame the victim are the ones that stick. He walked back to the police station through the evening chill. The fog was beginning to gather again, threading through the village streets like something searching. Luggs greeted him at the door with the enthusiasm of a dog who has been alone for at least 15 minutes and considers this a grievous injustice. Hamish made himself a late dinner and sat at his kitchen table with his notes spread before him. 3 interviews, 3 fragments of the truth. A young man still bitter after 3 decades. A teacher who remembered Katrina crying by the loch, burdened with dangerous knowledge. And a crofter who refused to speak at all. Somewhere in Lochdoub, someone had killed a young woman and let the village believe she'd run away. Someone who had lived here for 30 years since then, going about their daily business, nodding at neighbours, buying milk at the shop, walking their dog along the shore. Someone who was now watching to see what Hamish would do next. He looked out the window at the fog-wrapped village and thought about secrets, and how they grew heavier with time but never quite heavy enough to surface on their own. They needed help. They needed storms and erosion and the patient work of someone willing to dig. Hamish Macbeth had never minded digging. He turned back to his notes and began to plan the next day's interviews. There were 20 names left on his list, and somewhere among them was a murderer who had been very careful for a very long time. But careful, Hamish reflected, was not the same as clever. And time had a way of making people careless. He was counting on it. Chapter 4. A Warning in the Mist. The stone came through the kitchen window at 2:30 in the morning. Hamish woke to the sound of breaking glass and Luggs barking with the outraged fury of a dog whose sleep has been interrupted by vandalism. For a moment he lay still listening, but there was nothing beyond the window except the sound of the wind and the faint whisper of the loch. Whoever had thrown the stone was already gone. He climbed out of bed, pulled on his dressing gown and went to investigate. The stone lay on the kitchen floor among scattered fragments of glass, roughly the size of a tennis ball and wrapped in paper secured with an elastic band. Hamish picked it up carefully, noting that the paper was clean and dry despite the damp night, which suggested it had been thrown recently and from close range. He unfolded the paper. The message was brief and printed in block capitals, the sort of anonymous hand that could have belonged to anyone. Let the dead rest. Hamish read it twice, then set it on the table and went about sweeping up the glass. Luggs sat and watched with the expression of a dog who feels that insufficient attention is being paid to the gravity of the situation. Someone, said Hamish to him, is nervous. Luggs waffled in agreement. By morning the broken window had been temporarily boarded, and Hamish had made several telephone calls, none of which had been particularly satisfying. Detective Inspector Blair had been predictably dismissive, suggesting that village vandalism was hardly worth troubling about. The forensics laboratory had confirmed that the tin box would take at least another week to process, as the letters inside were water-damaged and extremely fragile, and the dental records for Katrina Drummond, if they existed at all, had not yet been located. Hamish drank his coffee and contemplated the note, which he had sealed in a plastic bag more from habit than from any real hope that it would yield useful evidence. The message was clear enough. Someone wanted him to stop asking questions, which meant, conversely, that his questions were getting close to something worth protecting. He was still considering this when Willie arrived at the door with the morning's second surprise. "The tin box has gone missing," said Willie without preamble. Hamish set down his coffee. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean someone broke into the evidence storage at Strathbane last night and took it. They're saying it was probably kids, but I heard it from my cousin who works there, and he says it was professional. Clean entry, nothing else touched, just the one item gone." "When did this happen?" "Sometime between midnight and 6 this morning. They're keeping it quiet for now." Hamish looked at the boarded window, then at the note on his table. and felt the familiar prickling sensation that meant someone was playing a careful game and didn't want the rules examined too closely. "Thank you, Willie. What are you going to do?" "Continue asking questions," said Hamish, with slightly more caution than before. Willie left, and Hamish sat for a long moment in his kitchen, thinking. The theft of the tin box was significant. Someone had gone to considerable risk and effort to retrieve it, which meant the letters inside contained something damaging enough to warrant burglary. The question was whether they had been taken to be destroyed, or simply to be read and assessed for danger. He was still mulling this over when there was a knock at the door. This time it was Jessie Crawford from the post office, looking flustered and slightly guilty. "Hamish," she said, "I need to talk to you." He made her tea and sat her down at the kitchen table, moving the plastic-wrapped note out of sight. Jessie wrapped her hands around the mug and stared into it as though reading fortunes in the steam. "I've been thinking about Katrina," she said finally, "about what I said at the shore, about it being her. I shouldn't have said it. It wasn't right blurting it out like that. But when I saw those bones, it was like seeing something I'd been expecting for 30 years. Does that make sense?" "It does." Jessie looked up at him. "I knew she hadn't run away. Everyone said she had, and after a while it was easier to agree than to keep insisting otherwise. But I knew." "Why did you know?" "Because of her mother, Margaret Drummond. She came into the post office every day for months after Katrina disappeared, asking if there'd been any letters, any word, and she grew thinner and older and quieter, and one day she just stopped coming, gave up. Died 2 years later, they said, of pneumonia, but I've always thought it was really of a broken heart." Jessie's voice wavered. "A mother knows, Hamish. Margaret knew her daughter was dead, and I knew she knew, but nobody wanted to listen. I'm listening now." Well, better late than never, I suppose." Jessie pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I brought you this. It's a photograph. I found it when I was sorting through some old things last night. It was taken at the summer Salith in 1997. That would have been July, I think, 4 months before Catriona disappeared." She unfolded the photograph and laid it on the table. It showed a group of people standing outside the village hall, drinks in hand, smiling at the camera with the slightly forced cheerfulness of people who have been told to stand still for a photograph. Hamish recognised several faces. Angus Moore, considerably younger but equally dour. Morag Finlayson, her hair not yet grey. And in the centre of the group, smiling with her head tilted slightly, a young woman with red hair and green eyes. "That's Katrina," said Jessie, pointing, "and that's Robert Gillies beside her, looking at her like she hung the moon. And that man on the other side, that's Alistair Campbell. He had the hotel back then, sold it 5 years ago and retired to Inverness." Hamish studied the photograph. Alistair Campbell was a tall man with dark hair and an expensive-looking watch, his arm around Katrina's shoulders in a way that seemed proprietary. Were they involved? That's what people said. Quietly, mind. He was married at the time, though not happily. His wife left him not long after Katrina disappeared, went back to Glasgow and divorced him. Jessie tapped the photograph. "And that woman there, half cut off at the edge, that's Sheila Murray, Donald Murray's sister. She was close with Katrina, or so I heard. Donald Murray who won't talk to me. The very same. Sheila doesn't live in Lochdoub anymore, moved to Fort William after she married. But she might talk to you, if you asked nicely." Hamish pocketed the photograph. "Thank you, Jessie. This is helpful." "Is it?" She looked doubtful. "I'm not sure stirring up the past is going to do anything except make people angry." "People are already angry," said Hamish, gesturing to the boarded window. "Someone threw a stone through my window last night with a note telling me to stop investigating." Jessie went pale. "Oh, Hamish, that's not vandalism, that's a threat." "I'm aware. Maybe you should listen to it. Maybe some things are better left buried. Would you have said that to Margaret Drummond? Would you have told her to stop hoping, stop wondering, stop grieving?" Jessie's eyes filled with tears. No, I wouldn't have." "Then I'll keep digging, and you'll keep your doors locked at night if you don't mind, just in case." After she left, Hamish sat alone with the photograph and the note, and the knowledge that he was now operating under what could politely be called hostile conditions. Someone in Lochdoub had killed Katrina Drummond 30 years ago. That same person, or their accomplice, had stolen the tin box from evidence storage and thrown a stone through his window as a warning. The question was whether they would escalate beyond warnings if he continued to press. Hamish rather thought they would. He spent the rest of the morning making telephone calls. The first was to Fort William. tracking down Sheila Murray, who agreed to meet him the following afternoon. The second was to Inverness, requesting information on Alistair Campbell, who had owned the hotel in 1997 and had been photographed with his arm around Katrina Drummond. The third was to his own sergeant in Strathbane, reporting the broken window and the theft of evidence in a tone that suggested he was taking both very seriously indeed. By afternoon the tin box had been returned. It appeared on the steps of the police station in broad daylight, wrapped in a plastic carrier bag and left where anyone passing might have seen it. Hamish found it when he came back from his walk with lugs, sitting there as casually as a bag of shopping. He brought it inside and examined it carefully. The box was still rusted, still dented, but it had been opened. The letters inside, he could see them through the transparent evidence bag someone had thoughtfully placed them in, had been rearranged. They were no longer tied with twine, and unless he was very much mistaken, there were fewer of them than there had been before. Someone had taken the box, read the letters, removed at least one, and then returned what remained. Not out of guilt or fear of prosecution, but as another message. I know what was in here. I've taken what matters. Your investigation is pointless. Hamish photographed the box from every angle, made detailed notes, and then called the forensics lab to inform them that the stolen evidence had been recovered and should be collected immediately. Then he sat down with a fresh cup of coffee and thought about people who made threats, and people who made statements, and how sometimes they were the same people operating at different levels of confidence. The stone through the window had been crude, a warning designed to frighten. The theft and return of the box had been elegant, a warning designed to demonstrate power, which meant he was dealing with someone who was both frightened and powerful, a dangerous combination, but also a revealing one. Frightened people made mistakes, and Hamish Macbeth had built an entire career out of waiting patiently for mistakes to surface. Outside, the mist was rolling in off the loch again, wrapping Loch Dubh in its familiar grey embrace. Somewhere in that mist, someone was watching and waiting, wondering whether the village constable would take the hint and let the matter lie. Hamish looked at the photograph of Katrina Drummond smiling at a summer sailith, and he thought about her mother checking for letters that would never come. Then he picked up his telephone and began making arrangements for tomorrow's interview in Fort William. Hints, he reflected, had never been his strong suit. Chapter 5. Echoes and Evasions. The drive to Fort William took just under 2 hours through country that grew progressively more dramatic as Hamish headed south. The morning was clear and cold, the sort of day when the highlands showed themselves at their most photogenic, all purple hills and sparkling water, and sheep arranged in picturesque clusters as though posing for a calendar. Lugg sat in the passenger seat with his nose pressed to the window, occasionally waffling at interesting smells that drifted in through the crack Hamish had left for ventilation purposes. Sheila Murray lived in a neat semi-detached house on the outskirts of Fort William, with a garden that suggested someone who liked flowers but didn't have much time for them. She answered the door in jeans and a jumper, a woman in her mid-40s with her brother's wary eyes and a considerably warmer manner. "You'll be the policeman from Loch Dubh," she said. "Come in, I've made tea." The sitting room was comfortable in the way of houses occupied by people with young children. Nothing too precious, everything chosen for durability rather than style. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, a wedding, 2 children at various ages, a golden retriever. Sheila poured tea and settled into an armchair opposite Hamish. "Donald phoned me," she said. "Told me you'd been round asking questions and that I shouldn't talk to you, which naturally made me want to talk to you very much indeed. My brother has always had that effect on people." "You were friends with Katrina Drummond," said Hamish. "I was. We both worked at the hotel, her as a waitress, me in housekeeping. We were the same age, more or less, and we got on well. She was clever, Katrina. Cleverer than most people in Loch Dubh gave her credit for." "What do you mean?" Sheila wrapped her hands around her mug. "She had ambitions, wanted to go to university, study law. She'd been saving money for it, working every hour she could get. But the hotel pay wasn't much, and her mother was ill. Not seriously, but enough that Katrina felt she couldn't leave. She was trapped, in the way people get trapped into small places when duty and dreams pull in opposite directions." "Did she have enemies?" "Enemies?" Sheila considered this. "Not enemies exactly, but she made people uncomfortable. She asked questions, she noticed things. The hotel had been having financial troubles that year. Alistair Campbell had taken out loans he couldn't repay. There were rumours of corners being cut, wages delayed. Katrina kept the books for him sometimes when his accountant wasn't available. I think she saw things she wasn't meant to see. Hamish leaned forward. What sort of things? I don't know specifically. She didn't tell me. But I remember her saying once that numbers didn't lie, even when people did. And she looked troubled when she said it, like she was carrying knowledge that weighed on her. Was she involved with Campbell? Sheila's expression hardened. He wanted to be involved with her. Made that clear enough. He was married, but his wife spent most of her time in Glasgow, and Alistair liked pretty girls who worked for him. Power and opportunity, you know. Katrina turned him down, which didn't please him. Men like that aren't used to being refused. How did he take the rejection? Not well. He stopped being friendly, started criticising her work, making little comments designed to undermine her. But she held firm. She wasn't the sort to be bullied. Sheila paused. And then there was Robert Gillies, the builder. He was just starting out then, barely making ends meet. He was besotted with Katrina, followed her around like a puppy. She liked him well enough, I think, but not the way he wanted her to. She tried to let him down gently, but he couldn't accept it, kept hoping she'd change her mind. Did he ever threaten her? Not threaten, no, but he was persistent. Too persistent. The sort of persistence that starts to feel like pressure after a while. Sheila set down her tea. The week before she disappeared, I saw them arguing near the loch. Robert was upset, saying she was making a mistake, that she didn't know what she was getting into, and Katrina told him to mind his own business, that she had to do what was right even if it cost her. Cost her what? She didn't say, but I've thought about it over the years, and I think she meant it would cost her safety, or her place in Lochdoub, or maybe both. Hamish made notes. Why didn't you tell the police this at the time? Sheila looked away. Because Donald told me not to. Said it would only cause trouble, that Katrina had made her own choices and we should respect them. He was very firm about it, and I was young, and I listened to my brother, which is something I've regretted ever since. Does Donald know something he's not telling? I think everyone in Lochdoub knows something they're not telling. That's how small places work, isn't it? Everyone carries a piece of the truth and no one wants to be the first to lay it down. She met his eyes. Will you find out what happened to her? I'll try. Good. She deserves that much. And her mother deserved better than dying without knowing. Hamish thanked her and left, his mind turning over this new information. Katrina had been clever, ambitious, and observant. She'd worked with the hotel's books and had seen something troubling. She'd rejected Alistair Campbell's advances and Robert Gillies's affections. And in the week before her death, she'd told someone she had to do what was right, even if it cost her. The shape of the thing was becoming clearer. Not the details, not yet, but the general outline. A young woman who knew something dangerous about someone powerful, someone who stood to lose a great deal if that knowledge became public. Back in Lochdoub, Hamish found a message waiting for him at the police station. The forensics report on the bones had come through. The remains were consistent with a female aged 20 to 25, dead for approximately 25 to 30 years. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The blow had been severe enough to fracture the bone and would have been immediately fatal. Not an accident, then. Not a fall or a drowning or any of the convenient explanations people preferred. Murder, plain and deliberate. Hamish sat with the report for a long time, looking at the clinical language that reduced a life to measurements and observations. Katrina Drummond, aged 22, struck from behind and left in the peat ground to be forgotten. His next interview was with Morag Finlayson, who ran the wool shop and had been among the first at the shore when the bones were discovered. He found her behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of yarn in colours that reminded him of the moors in summer, heather and sage and soft grey blue. "Mrs. Finlayson," said Hamish, "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions." Morag set down the yarn she'd been holding. She was a small woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes, and the sort of face that gave nothing away unless she wanted it to. "I've been expecting you," she said. "You'll want to know about Katrina." "I would." "Then lock the door and turn the sign. I don't want half the village listening in." Hamish did as instructed. When he turned back, Morag had moved to the small sitting area at the back of the shop where she sometimes held knitting circles. She gestured for him to sit. "Katrina came to me 3 weeks before she disappeared," said Morag without preamble. "Asked if I knew about land sales in the 90s, the early 90s specifically. Said she'd been going through old records at the hotel and had found something that didn't add up." "What didn't add up?" "A piece of land near Score Moor, the peat ground. It had been sold by the estate to a private buyer in 1992, but the paperwork was odd. The price was far too low, and the buyer's name didn't match up with who actually ended up owning it. Katrina thought there had been fraud involved. Someone using a frontman to buy valuable land for nothing, then flipping it for profit once the development permissions came through. Did she say who she suspected? No, but she asked me if I remembered who'd had financial troubles in the early 90s and who'd suddenly come into money around 1993 or 1994. She was methodical about it, working backwards from the evidence. And what did you tell her? Morag's expression was grim. I told her to be careful. That powerful people don't like clever girls asking uncomfortable questions. I told her that land deals in the Highlands have a way of involving people you wouldn't want to cross, and I asked her if her questions were worth her life. What did she say? She said they were worth the truth, and that the truth mattered more than being comfortable. Morag's voice wavered slightly. She was braver than I was, Constable, and it killed her. Do you know who was involved in the land deal? I have suspicions, but suspicions aren't proof, and I've lived in Loughdube long enough to know the difference. Tell me your suspicions. Morag hesitated, then said quietly, Alistair Campbell had money troubles in the early 90s, suddenly didn't in 1994. Expanded the hotel, bought a new car, took expensive holidays. And the land near Score Moor? That's where they wanted to build a golf course and resort. Never happened, but the permissions were in place. Someone stood to make a fortune if it went through. Hamish absorbed this. Anyone else? Robert Gillies started his building business in 1994. Couldn't have had the capital for it based on what he'd been earning before then. Someone gave him money, or he found money, or he took money that wasn't his. Could they have been working together? Could have been. Or could have been rivals. Or one could have helped the other cover up the original fraud. Take your pick of scenarios, Constable. 30 years is long enough for the truth to grow whiskers and a tail. Hamish thanked her and left, his mind full of land deals and money, and the sort of corruption that grew quietly in small places where everyone knew everyone and nobody wanted to disturb the peace. By the time he returned to the police station, the afternoon was fading into early evening. He made himself dinner and sat with lugs at his feet, thinking about a young woman who'd asked questions about land sales, and ended up dead in the peat ground where the questionable land was located. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental. Somewhere in Loughdube someone had killed to protect a 30-year-old fraud. The question now was whether they would kill again to keep it hidden. Hamish rather thought they might. He locked his doors carefully that night, and slept with one ear open for the sound of breaking glass. Chapter 6. The Second Death. The call came at 6 in the morning, which in Hamish's experience was never a good sign. People who telephoned policemen before breakfast were generally bearing news of the sort that required immediate attention, and would ruin one's porridge. This particular call came from Archie McLean, a fisherman who had been up since 4 and had just returned to shore with more than he'd bargained for. There's a body, said Archie without ceremony, down at the peat ground, same place they found the bones. Hamish was already reaching for his clothes. Dead how long? Not long. Still warm when I found him. Well, warmish. It's a cold morning. Him? I, Robert Gillies. I recognised him straight off, even with his head staved in. Hamish felt something cold settle in his stomach. Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 5 minutes. He was there in 4, with lugs left behind and locked in the kitchen for his own safety. The scene at Score Moor was grimly familiar. The same exposed bank where Katrina's bones had been found. The same peaty earth, but this time with a body that was unmistakably recent and unmistakably violent. Robert Gillies lay face down at the edge of the excavation site, his head at an angle that suggested the blow had come from behind and above. Blood had pooled in the dark earth, mixing with rainwater from the night's drizzle. His hands were scraped and muddy, as though he'd tried to break his fall, or had been crawling when the final blow landed. Archie McLean stood a respectful distance away, his face pale. I was walking back from the boat and saw him lying there. Thought at first he'd fallen, but then I saw the blood. Hamish crouched beside the body without touching it, noting the details. Gillies was wearing work clothes, boots, heavy trousers, a fleece jacket. His pockets contained keys, a wallet, and a mobile phone that showed the time of his last call, 11:43 the previous evening. The call had been to a number Hamish didn't recognise, and had lasted less than a minute. The weapon, if there had been a weapon, was not immediately visible. The blow could have been struck with a rock, a piece of timber, or any of a dozen heavy objects that might be lying about in a place like this. Or the killer could have brought something with them and taken it away again. Hamish stood and looked around. The ground was soft from recent rain, which meant there should have been tracks. And indeed there were. Archie's clear boot prints coming from the shore, and another set, smaller and less distinct, leading from the road down to where Gillies lay. The killer's tracks, presumably, though they petered out on the harder ground near the road itself. "Did you see anyone when you came up from the shore?" Hamish asked. "Not a soul. It's early yet. Most folk are still abed." Hamish made the necessary telephone calls, to Strathbane, to the forensics team, to Detective Inspector Blair, who answered with all the enthusiasm of a man being dragged from his breakfast. By the time the sun had properly risen, the peat ground was once again cordoned off and filling with official personnel. Blair arrived and surveyed the scene with the expression of a man whose day has just become considerably more complicated. "Same location as the old bones," he observed. "Aye? Connected, you think?" "I'd say it's likely," Blair grunted. "What was Gillies doing here in the middle of the night? Meeting someone, perhaps, or investigating something. His phone shows a call at 11:43. I'll need to trace the number." "Do that." Blair turned to the forensics photographer. "Get everything, and someone find the weapon. It'll be nearby if we're lucky, halfway to Inverness if we're not." Hamish left them to their work and walked slowly around the perimeter of the scene, looking for what the official investigation might miss. He found it about 30 yards from the body, a piece of paper sodden with rain and half buried in mud that looked as though it had been dropped rather than deliberately placed. He extracted it carefully with a twig and examined it. It was a photocopy of what appeared to be a property deed, dated 1992. The print was blurred and water-damaged, but Hamish could make out enough. A sale of land near Score Moor from the estate to a company called Highland Developments listed. The price was listed as £15,000, which even Hamish knew was absurdly low for 20 acres of coastal land with development potential. He placed the paper in an evidence bag and pocketed it before Blair could notice. Then he returned to the police station, made himself the breakfast he'd missed, and sat down to think. Robert Gillies had been at Score Moor late at night, carrying a photocopy of a fraudulent land deed. He'd made a phone call shortly before his death, and someone had killed him in the same place where Katrina Drummond had been killed 30 years earlier. The connection was inescapable. Gillies had either been involved in Katrina's murder, or had known who was, or had discovered something new that made him dangerous. And someone had decided that one murder was worth repeating to keep the past buried. Hamish traced the number from Gillies's phone. It belonged to Alistair Campbell. He sat back and considered this. Campbell, the former hotel owner, who had hired Katrina and had financial troubles that mysteriously resolved. Campbell, who had made advances toward Katrina and been rejected. Campbell, who now lived in Inverness, and had presumably thought himself safely distant from his past. The question was whether Gillies had called Campbell to threaten him, to warn him, or to arrange a meeting, and whether Campbell had then driven to Lochdew and killed him, or whether the call had alerted someone else who had done the killing for their own reasons. Hamish finished his breakfast, put lugs in the Land Rover and drove to Inverness. Alistair Campbell lived in a large detached house on the outskirts of the city, the sort of house that spoke of money but not necessarily taste. The garden was professionally maintained but characterless. A new Mercedes sat in the driveway. Campbell answered the door in shirt-sleeves and reading glasses, looking like a man who had been going through paperwork. He was in his early 60s now, still handsome in a weathered way, with the sort of tan that came from expensive holidays rather than outdoor work. "Mr. Campbell," said Hamish, "I'm PC Macbeth from Lochdew. I need to ask you a few questions." Campbell's expression shifted. Not quite fear, but a wariness that suggested he knew why a policeman had come calling. "You'd better come in." The study was lined with books that looked as though they'd never been read. Campbell gestured Hamish to a leather chair and remained standing himself, which people generally did when they wanted to maintain a psychological advantage. "This is about the bones," said Campbell. "It is, and about Robert Gillies." "Gillies. What about him?" "He was found dead this morning at Score Moor. Murdered." Campbell went very still. For a moment he said nothing, and Hamish watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. What to admit, what to deny, how much the police might already know. "I see," said Campbell finally. "He called you last night at 11:43. What did he want?" How do you know he called me? His phone records. Campbell moved to the window and stood looking out at his expensive garden. He said he had information about the land sale in 1992. He wanted money to keep quiet about it. Blackmail, in other words. He didn't use that word, but yes, blackmail. And what did you tell him? I told him to go to hell, that I had nothing to hide and he could do his worst. Campbell turned back to face Hamish. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. I was here all night. My housekeeper can confirm it. What land sale was he referring to? Campbell hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. The peat ground at Scormore's 20 acres. I bought it in 1992 through a front company, at well below market value. It was supposed to become a golf resort. Would have been worth millions if it had gone through. But the planning permission was refused, and I was left with worthless land and a lot of debt. How did you manage to buy it so cheaply? I had inside information, knew the estate was desperate for cash and would accept a lowball offer. It wasn't illegal, just opportunistic. And Katrina Drummond found out about this. Campbell's jaw tightened. She saw the books, put the pieces together. She was clever, that girl. Too clever for her own good. Did you kill her? No. The word came out flat and hard. I didn't kill her. I wanted to. I'll admit that. Wanted to shut her up before she ruined me. But I didn't do it. Someone else got to her first. Who? I don't know. But I have my suspicions. Tell me. Campbell returned to his desk and pulled out a folder. After Gillies called last night, I went through my old papers, found these. He handed Hamish several documents, bank statements, cancelled cheques, correspondence. Robert Gillies started his building business in 1994. His start-up capital came from a loan I gave him. £50,000. Why would you loan him that much money? Because he did me a favour. A very specific favour. Campbell met Hamish's eyes. The night Katrina disappeared, Gillies came to the hotel, said he'd done something terrible and needed help. He was covered in mud, panicking, barely coherent. I gave him money to clean up his business and keep his mouth shut, and he did for 30 years, until last night when he decided £50,000 wasn't enough anymore. Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place. You're saying Gillies killed Katrina. I'm saying he certainly acted like someone who'd just committed a murder, and I made the mistake of helping him cover it up, which makes me an accessory after the fact. But I didn't kill either of them, Constable, I swear it on my life. Then who killed Gillies? Campbell shook his head. That's what I don't know. Unless there was someone else involved. Someone who had as much to lose as I did. Someone who decided Gillies was too dangerous to keep alive once he started asking for more money. Hamish stood. I'll need you to come to Strathbane and make a formal statement. I expected as much. And Mr. Campbell, don't leave Inverness. We may have more questions. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub with his mind racing. Campbell's story had the ring of truth, which meant Robert Gillies had likely killed Katrina, perhaps accidentally, perhaps in anger, but killed her nonetheless. And then someone else had killed Gillies to keep him from talking. But who? Campbell claimed he had an alibi, which meant there was a third person involved, someone who had helped conceal the original crime, or who had their own reasons for wanting both Katrina and Gillies dead. Someone who was still in Lochdoub, walking its streets, living a normal life. Someone who had now killed twice, and might not hesitate to kill again. Hamish pulled up at the police station and sat for a moment, thinking about land deals and blackmail, and the way secrets multiplied in the dark like bacteria in a petri dish. Then he went inside and began making a list of everyone who might have had something to lose 30 years ago, and whether they had alibis for last night. It was going to be a very long day. Chapter 7. The Accident That Wasn't. The forensics laboratory in Inverness had finally managed to extract and photograph the letters from the tin box, and they arrived by email attachment late that afternoon. Hamish opened them on his laptop with the sort of careful attention one might give to ancient manuscripts, which, in a sense, they were. There had been 8 letters originally. 7 remained, carefully photographed and transcribed. The missing one, Hamish suspected, had been the most important. But even without it, the remaining letters told a story. They were all in the same hand, Katrina's, based on the signature. They were dated between June and early November of 1997, and they read like a woman documenting something she expected to need as evidence. Not love letters or personal reflections, but careful observations. The first letter, dated June 15th, described discrepancies in the hotel's accounts. Money that should have been paid to suppliers but hadn't been. Invoices that didn't match the work completed. Small things, easily explained away as clerical errors if challenged, but forming a pattern when viewed together. The second letter, July the 2nd, noted a conversation overheard between Alistair Campbell and another man whose name wasn't given. They'd been discussing the land at Score Moor, the failed golf resort, and how the debt from that disaster was threatening to sink the hotel. Campbell had said something about finding another way to make it profitable, and the other man had laughed and said, as long as nobody looks too closely. The third and fourth letters, dated through August and September, continued in the same vein. Katrina documenting irregularities, recording conversations, building a case. She had clearly intended to report Campbell to someone, the police perhaps, or the tax authorities. She was methodical about it, gathering evidence piece by piece. The fifth letter, October 12th, was different in tone. Katrina wrote that she'd made a terrible discovery, that the land fraud was worse than she'd thought, that it wasn't just Campbell involved but someone else, someone she'd trusted, someone who would be destroyed if the truth came out. She wrote that she'd confronted this person and they'd begged her to stay quiet, offered her money, threatened her subtly. The sixth letter, October 28th, was brief and frightened. She wrote that she'd been followed, that someone had been in her room at the cottage where she lived with her mother, that her mother's cat had been killed and left on the doorstep as a warning. She was scared but determined. She'd hidden copies of everything she'd found, and she'd made plans to go to the authorities in Inverness after the 1st of November, when she'd have enough money saved to leave Lochdoub and not come back. The seventh and final letter was dated November 9th, 1997. One day before she disappeared, it read, "I've decided to give them one last chance. I'm meeting R tonight at the peat ground to give him the evidence and tell him what I know. He says he didn't realise how deep it went, that he was lied to and used. He says if I give him time, he'll make it right without destroying innocent people. I want to believe him. He's been kind to me, always. But I'm taking this letter with me just in case. If anything happens to me, the truth is in what I've written here. Let it speak for me. Robert Gillies." Hamish sat back and closed his eyes, seeing it all now with terrible clarity. Katrina had discovered the land fraud. She'd worked out that Campbell wasn't acting alone, that someone else had been involved in the scheme. She'd confronted Gillies, who had begged for her silence, and when she'd refused, when she'd arranged to meet him with all her evidence to give him one last chance to confess and make restitution, he'd killed her instead. Perhaps he'd panicked. Perhaps he'd planned it. Either way, he'd struck her from behind. The coroner's report confirmed a blow to the back of the skull, and buried her in the peat ground where the fraudulent land lay. Where she'd planned to meet him, where she'd foolishly trusted that kindness and reasonableness would prevail over desperation and self-preservation. Then he'd gone to Campbell, covered in mud and guilt, and Campbell had paid him off to keep quiet. £50,000 to start a business and build a respectable life. To forget what he'd done, and let the village forget along with him. And it had worked, for 30 years, until the storm exposed what should have stayed buried, and Gillies had made the fatal mistake of trying to leverage his guilt into more money. But there was still the missing piece, the third person, the someone else who had been involved in the land fraud and who had killed Gillies to keep him from talking. Hamish read through the letters again, looking for the name that wasn't there. Someone she'd trusted, Katrina had written. Someone who would be destroyed if the truth came out. Someone who had been in on the land deal and had stood to lose everything. He pulled out his notes from earlier interviews. Morag Finlayson had mentioned that both Campbell and Gillies had come into money in 1994, but she'd also said that someone had to have given planning permission for the golf resort. Someone on the council, presumably. Someone local who could smooth the way. Hamish reached for the telephone and called the council offices in Strathbane. After 20 minutes of being transferred between departments, he finally reached someone who could access historical records. "I need to know who was on the planning committee for Highland Region in 1992, said Hamish. There was typing. Then, "I can get you that information. Give me your email and I'll send it over." It arrived 10 minutes later, a list of 7 names. Hamish scanned through them, recognising most as retired or deceased. But one name jumped out at him with the force of a physical blow. Angus Morridge, old Angus, who'd been at the shore when the bones were discovered, who'd been among the first MacLeod had interviewed in 1997, who'd told the constable that Katrina had been planning to leave for Glasgow, which had been an obvious lie designed to make her disappearance seem voluntary. Angus Moore, who in 1992 would have been in his early 50s and serving on the planning committee that approved development permissions for the entire region. Hamish sat very still, thinking about an old crofter who lived alone at the south end of the village and who had been far too quiet when the bones were found, who had stood apart from the others, saying nothing while everyone speculated and gossiped, who would have known that Campbell was buying land and would have been in position to ensure the planning permission went through, who would have taken a cut of the profits when the resort was built, and who would have lost everything, his reputation, his pension, possibly his freedom, if Katrina had gone to the authorities with evidence of the fraud. Hamish checked his watch, 6:30 and getting dark. He pulled on his jacket, made sure his mobile was charged, and walked out to the Land Rover. Lugg started to follow, but Hamish shook his head. "Not this time, boy. Stay." Luggs whined but obeyed. Angus Moore's croft sat at the end of a long track that wound through rough grazing land toward the sea. It was an old stone building, well maintained but austere, with a barn and a few outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, a light showed in one window. Hamish parked at the end of the track and walked the last 100 yards, listening. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere a sheep called out, lonely and complaining, but there was no other sound. He knocked on the door, waited, knocked again. The door opened. Angus Moore stood in the threshold, backlit by lamplight, his face in shadow. He was a big man still, despite his years, with the thick shoulders and strong hands of someone who'd worked the land all his life. "Constable," he said, "I wondered when you'd come. May I come in?" "I don't think that's wise. Better we talk out here." They stood in the gathering dark, two men on a threshold, with the wind bringing the smell of peat and salt water and the particular dampness that meant rain was coming. "You were on the planning committee in 1992, said Hamish. "I was." "You approved the development at Scoremore." "I did. It was legal, within the rules. But the land sale wasn't. Campbell bought it through fraud and you helped him, in exchange for a cut of the profits." Angus said nothing. "Katrina Drummond found out. She was going to report you, so you killed her." "No." The word was flat and final. "I didn't kill that girl. I wanted to. God help me, I thought about it, but I didn't do it. Robert Gillies did." "How do you know?" "Because he told me. Came to me the night after, shaking like a leaf. Said it had been an accident. They'd argued, she'd threatened him, and he'd pushed her. She'd hit her head on a rock. He'd panicked and buried her." Angus's voice was rough. "He asked me what to do, and I told him to keep his mouth shut and let people believe she'd run away. I was protecting myself as much as him. If she'd lived to talk, we'd both have been ruined." "So you helped him cover it up?" "I did, and I've regretted it every day since. But I didn't kill her, Constable, and I didn't kill Robert Gillies either." "Where were you 2 nights ago between 11 and midnight?" "Right here, asleep in my bed, where I am every night at that hour." "Can anyone confirm that?" "I live alone, have done for 15 years since my wife died. So no, nobody can confirm it, but it's the truth nonetheless." Hamish studied the old man's face in the dim light. "If you didn't kill Gillies, who did?" Angus shook his head. "I don't know, but someone else knew. Someone else was involved or found out about it. Someone who decided Robert was too dangerous to let live." "Who?" "If I knew that, Constable, I'd tell you. But I've been sitting here for 2 days trying to work it out, and I can't. All I know is that 3 people knew the truth about Katrina's death. Campbell, Gillies and me. Now Gillies is dead. Campbell's in Inverness, and I'm an old man with no reason to kill anyone." The rain began then, soft and insistent. Angus stepped back into his doorway. "You'll be wanting to arrest me," he said, "for accessory after the fact. Yes. Tomorrow then, let me sleep in my own bed one more night. I'll come to the station first thing in the morning. You have my word?" Hamish hesitated, then nodded. "First thing." "Aye, first thing." The door closed. Hamish walked back to the Land Rover through the rain, his mind turning over what he knew and what he didn't. 3 people had known about Katrina's death, but someone else had killed Gillies to silence him, which meant either Angus was lying or there was a 4th person, someone who had learned the truth and decided to take justice into their own hands, or to protect themselves from exposure, Someone who was still out there in the rainy darkness, watching and waiting. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub with his headlights cutting through the rain, and he thought about secrets and how they never stayed buried quite as deeply as people hoped. Chapter 8. Two Shadows from the Past. Angus Moore did not appear at the police station the following morning. By 10 o'clock, Hamish was driving back out to the croft, this time with a sense of foreboding that proved entirely justified. He found the old man in his barn, hanging from a beam with a length of rope around his neck, and an overturned stool beneath his feet. The suicide note was pinned to his jacket with a safety pin, written in the careful script of a man accustomed to signing official documents. "I killed Robert Gillies," it read. "He was going to tell everything to save himself, and I couldn't let him destroy what's left of my name. I killed Katrina too, though Gillies helped. We both did it. Let that be the end of it. Angus Moore." Hamish stood in the cold barn and read the note 3 times, and with each reading he became more convinced that it was a lie. Not the lie of a guilty man trying to shift blame, but the lie of a man taking blame that wasn't his. The handwriting was Angus's own. Hamish had seen enough of his signature on old council documents to know that. But the content felt wrong, staged. The work of someone who had decided to end things on his own terms rather than face public disgrace and prison. Or the work of someone who had been murdered and had the note placed on him afterward. Hamish called it in, secured the scene, and waited for the forensics team with a growing sense that he'd been expertly manoeuvred. Someone had killed Gillies, then either convinced Angus to take the blame and kill himself, or had killed Angus and staged it to look like suicide. Either way, the investigation was being closed for him. 2 men dead, one of them confessing to both murders in a suicide note. Blair would be delighted. The paperwork would be straightforward. The case would be marked solved, and everyone could go back to their ordinary lives. Everyone except Hamish, who had the stubborn and inconvenient habit of insisting on the truth even when a comfortable lie was being offered. He drove back to Lochdoub and sat in his kitchen with his notes spread across the table. Lugs leaned against his leg, sensing his master's troubled mood. "Someone," Hamish said to the dog, "is very clever, and that someone thinks I'm very stupid." Lugs made a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been a request for biscuits. Hamish looked at his timeline. 2 people had certainly known about the land fraud and Katrina's discovery of it, Campbell and Angus Moore. Gillies had killed Katrina, probably in a panic when she confronted him. Campbell and Angus had helped cover it up. Campbell by paying Gillies to disappear into respectability. Angus by telling the investigating constable that Katrina had planned to leave. But someone else had known too. Someone who had waited 30 years and then, when the bones were discovered and Gillies started demanding more money, had killed him to keep him quiet. And then had either killed Angus or convinced him to take the blame. Who? Hamish returned to his interviews looking for the person he'd missed, someone who had been in Lochdoub in 1997, someone who had motive to protect the secret, someone who was clever enough to stage a suicide and bold enough to commit murder. His telephone rang. It was Morag Finlayson from the wool shop, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite fear but close to it. "Hamish, you need to come. I've remembered something I should have told you days ago." He found her in the back room of the shop with the door locked and the closed sign up. She'd made tea but hadn't touched it, and her hands shook when she gestured him to sit. "I lied to you," she said without preamble. "Or rather, I didn't tell you the complete truth, about Katrina coming to ask me about the land sales." "What didn't you tell me?" "She didn't just ask me about who'd had money troubles. She showed me documents, photocopies of council records, planning permissions, payment receipts. She'd been very thorough." Morag wrapped her arms around herself. "And she told me something else. She said there were 2 people involved in the fraud. Campbell, yes, but also someone on the council, and she said there was a 3rd person who'd found out about it and had been helping to hide it ever since. Someone who hadn't been part of the original crime but had become complicit afterward." "Who?" "She wouldn't tell me the name. Said she wanted to be sure before she accused anyone, but she did say it was someone people trusted, someone respectable, someone who would be destroyed if it came out." Morag met his eyes. "And she said she felt sorry for this person, that they'd been trapped by circumstances and hadn't known what else to do. Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I was frightened. I still am. 2 men are dead, Hamish, and whoever killed them is still here, walking around, shopping in my store, nodding hello in the street. I don't want to be the 3rd. Hamish leaned forward. Did Katrina give you any hint? Anything that might identify this third person? Morag hesitated. She said something odd. She said this person had lost everything once already and couldn't bear to lose everything again. That they'd made one bad choice and it had poisoned their whole life. Lost everything once already. Hamish turned the phrase over in his mind. Someone who had suffered a significant loss before 1997. Someone whose life had been marked by tragedy or failure. He thanked Morag and left, his mind sifting through the population of Lochdub. Who fit that description? Who had lost everything and rebuilt, only to find themselves trapped by the fear of losing it again? He was walking past the primary school when the answer came to him, with the sudden clarity of a light switching on in a dark room. Fiona Kennedy. Fiona Macpherson, as she'd been in 1997. Fiona who'd told him she'd seen Katrina crying by the loch. Who'd said Katrina had discovered something terrible about someone she trusted. Who'd been 15 in 1997 and living with a mother she fought with constantly. Hamish had assumed at the time that she was simply a witness, a sympathetic teenager who'd been kind to an older girl in distress. But what if there was more to it? He returned to the police station and began searching through old records, this time looking not for Katrina's file but for anything related to the Macpherson family. He found it in a folder of miscellaneous reports from 1996, a fire at the Macpherson house. Cause? Arson. The mother's second husband, Fiona's stepfather, had been arrested and convicted. He'd burned down the house in a fit of rage after an argument, destroying everything the family owned. The insurance had refused to pay out because of the criminal nature of the fire. The Macphersons had lost everything. House, possessions, savings. They'd been taken in by relatives, living in cramped quarters, surviving on charity. And then, in 1994, they'd suddenly come into enough money to buy a new house. A modest cottage, but theirs outright. Where had that money come from? Hamish telephoned the council offices again. This time he asked for employment records. Specifically, records for the planning department. The answer came back within the hour. Margaret Macpherson, Fiona's mother, had worked as a secretary in the planning department from 1991 to 1998. She would have had access to all the documents related to the Scoremore development, all the paperwork that Angus Moore had pushed through, and she would have known exactly what was being done. Hamish sat back, seeing it now. Margaret Macpherson, desperate after the fire, had discovered the fraud, had realised that Campbell and Angus were involved in something illegal, and instead of reporting it, she'd blackmailed them. Not for a fortune, but for enough to rebuild her life. Enough for a house. Enough to give her daughter a stable home again. And when Katrina had started investigating the land sale, when she'd started asking dangerous questions, Margaret would have known that everything was at risk. Her house, her security, the stability she'd fought so hard to build for her daughter. Had she known about Katrina's meeting with Gillies that night? Had she followed them? Had she been there when Gillies killed Katrina, and had she helped cover it up to protect her own secret? And had she, 30 years later, killed Gillies when he started talking? Killed Angus when he might have exposed her? Hamish picked up his telephone to call Strathbane, then paused. If Margaret Macpherson was the killer, she'd already proven herself capable of murder and staging crime scenes. Calling for backup would alert her through the police radio that anyone in the village might be listening to. Better to approach carefully, to gather what evidence he could before making an arrest. He was still considering this when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Fiona Kennedy standing there, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "Constable," she said, "I need to talk to you. About my mother." Hamish let her in and made tea, moving slowly and giving her time to compose herself. When they were both seated, she began to speak. "My mother died 3 years ago. Cancer. Before she died, she told me things. Things she'd kept secret all my life." Fiona's voice shook. "She told me about the land fraud, about how she found out and used it to get money after our house burned. She said she'd had no choice, that we'd have been homeless otherwise, that she'd done what she had to do to survive." "Did she tell you about Katrina?" "She said she knew what happened, that she'd been there that night, watching from a distance, that she'd seen Gillies and Katrina arguing, and then Gillies had pushed her, and Katrina had fallen and hit her head. My mother said it was an accident, that Gillies panicked and buried her, and that Campbell and Angus helped him cover it up." Fiona wiped her eyes. She said she kept quiet because if it came out, she'd have to admit to the blackmail and we'd lose everything again. So she stayed silent and let them believe Katrina had run away. Why are you telling me this now? Because Robert Gillies is dead, and Angus Moore is dead, and I think someone is killing everyone who knew the truth. Fiona looked at him with desperate eyes. I think someone wants to erase the past completely, and I'm frightened that I might be next. Hamish felt cold certainty settle over him. Your mother told you all this before she died. Yes. Did she tell anyone else? I don't know. She might have. She was on a lot of medication toward the end. Sometimes she got confused about who she was talking to. Who visited her in the hospital? Lots of people. It's a small village. Everyone visits the dying. Think carefully. Who visited frequently? Who spent time alone with her? Fiona's face went very still. Then she whispered a name. And Hamish knew. He knew who had visited a dying woman and learned her secrets. Who had waited 3 years and then, when the storm exposed the bones, had decided to eliminate everyone who knew the truth. Who had killed Gillies and staged Angus's suicide and was now the only person left alive who knew what had really happened 30 years ago. The only person besides Fiona herself, who was sitting in his kitchen crying, telling him a story that painted her as an innocent victim when she was actually the killer. Hamish looked at Fiona Kennedy and saw the truth in her face, the calculation beneath the tears, the performance beneath the grief. Your mother didn't tell you those things before she died, he said quietly. You already knew them, because you were there that night in 1997. You followed Katrina to the peat ground, you saw what happened, and you've been keeping the secret ever since. Fiona's tears stopped. Her face went blank, then hardened into something cold and determined. Prove it, she said. Chapter 9. The Witness Who Stayed Silent. The silence that followed Fiona Kennedy's challenge stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Outside, the afternoon was grey and still, the sort of day when Lochdoub seemed to hold its breath waiting for something to happen. Hamish remained seated, his posture deliberately relaxed despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. One did not confront a killer by showing fear or urgency. One proceeded with the careful patience of someone coaxing a nervous animal into a trap. You're quite right, he said mildly. I can't prove anything yet. Which is why we're going to sit here and have a civilized conversation about what actually happened. And then, when I've heard your version, I'll tell you what I think. Fiona's jaw tightened. I don't have to tell you anything. No, you don't. You can walk out of here right now if you like. But then I'll have to bring you in for formal questioning, and Detective Inspector Blair will be involved, and he's considerably less pleasant than I am. Hamish poured more tea, the domestic gesture deliberately disarming. Or you can sit here in my kitchen, drink your tea and tell me what really happened. Your choice entirely. She sat very still, calculating. Then, perhaps deciding that controlling the narrative was worth the risk, she picked up her tea and took a sip. You won't understand, she said. Try me. Fiona stared into her cup. When she spoke again, her voice was different, younger, more fragile, as though she were 15 again, and the weight of the world had just fallen on her shoulders. I followed Katrina that night, November 9th. I'd been worried about her for weeks. She'd been frightened, distracted. I knew she was planning something, meeting someone. I thought, she paused, I thought she might be in danger, so I followed her to the peat ground. And you saw what happened. I saw them arguing. Robert Gillies was shouting, saying she was going to ruin everything, that she didn't understand what she was doing, and Katrina was trying to calm him down, saying she just wanted him to do the right thing, to come forward and confess and make it right. She was holding papers, her evidence, I suppose, and then Robert lunged for them and they struggled and he pushed her. Fiona's voice caught. It wasn't murder, not really. He pushed her in anger and she stumbled backward and there was a rock. She hit her head, just once, but it was enough. What did you do? I froze. I was 15 years old, hiding in the dark, and I'd just watched someone die. Robert was panicking, calling her name, trying to wake her up, and then... She closed her eyes. Then my mother appeared. Hamish leaned forward. Your mother was there. She'd followed me. She'd suspected I'd sneak out. I'd been doing it regularly that summer, and she'd followed to bring me home. She saw it all. And instead of calling for help, instead of going to the police, she saw an opportunity. Tell me. She'd been blackmailing Campbell and Angus for 2 years by then, getting money to rebuild after the fire, but it was never quite enough, never quite secure, And suddenly here was Robert Gillies, a young man who'd just killed someone desperate and terrified, and here was Katrina dead, with all her evidence in her hands. Fiona's voice grew harder. My mother took charge. She told Robert to bury Katrina. She took the evidence Katrina had gathered and told Robert she'd keep it safe, that if he ever spoke about what happened, she'd go to the police. And she told him to go to Campbell and Angus to tell them what he'd done and to get them to help him set up a respectable life, in exchange for everyone's silence. And you? I watched. I didn't say anything. I was terrified and in shock, and my mother told me that if I ever spoke about what I'd seen, we'd lose everything. The house, our security, everything she'd fought to give me after the fire. She said it was an accident, that Robert hadn't meant to kill anyone and that Katrina was dead regardless of what we did. Better to protect ourselves than to destroy everyone over an accident. So you stayed silent. For 30 years. Fiona looked up at him, her eyes hard. I stayed silent through school, through university, through my marriage and my children and my whole life. I carried it like a stone in my chest. And I told myself it was the right thing, that my mother had made the best choice she could in an impossible situation. Until the bones were discovered. Until the bones were discovered, she repeated. And suddenly it was all coming back. Robert Gillies getting nervous, making phone calls, Angus Moore looking haunted, Campbell's name being mentioned. And I realised that someone would talk, that the truth would come out, and when it did, everything would point back to my mother, to what she'd done that night. So you killed Gillies. Fiona set down her teacup with exaggerated care. I didn't say that. You did, though. Perhaps not in so many words, but you did. Hamish leaned back. You called him, didn't you? Told him you needed to talk about what happened. He knew who you were. You'd been there that night. You were Margaret's daughter. He trusted you, or at least trusted that you wanted the same thing he did, for the past to stay buried. So he met you at Score Moor, and you killed him. Again, prove it. His phone records show a call from a mobile that hasn't been traced yet, but it will be. Technology being what it is these days, everything can be traced given enough time, and when it is, it will lead back to a burner phone that you bought somewhere outside Lochdoub to avoid suspicion. Fiona said nothing. And then, Hamish continued, you went to Angus Moore. You told him that you'd killed Gillies to protect everyone, that if he didn't take the blame and make it look like suicide, you'd tell the police about his role in covering up Katrina's death. You knew he was old, tired, sick of carrying the guilt. You convinced him that confessing and ending his life was the noble thing to do, that it would spare everyone else. I didn't kill Angus, Fiona said. He hanged himself. After you told him to, which makes you responsible just the same. They sat in silence. Hamish could hear Lugs breathing heavily in the corner, and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and calm despite the circumstances. Here's what I think really happened, said Hamish. I think you've told me the truth about the night Katrina died. Robert Gillies killed her, your mother turned it into blackmail, and you stayed silent to protect your family. That part, I believe. Very generous of you. But I think you've been lying about what you felt. You said you carried it like a stone in your chest, that it weighed on you. I don't think that's true. I think you rationalised it years ago, told yourself that protecting your mother and your home was worth more than justice for a dead girl, that Katrina was unlucky but that was life, and you weren't responsible for other people's choices. Fiona's face remained impassive. And then the bones were discovered, Hamish continued, and you realised that your comfortable life was at risk, your position as a respected teacher, your reputation in Lochdoub, everything you'd built, so you decided to eliminate everyone who knew the truth, not out of panic or fear, but out of cold calculation. You killed Gillies because he was weak and might talk. You manipulated Angus into killing himself because he was the perfect scapegoat. And you came here today to see if I suspected you, and to gauge whether you needed to kill me too. The silence stretched longer this time. Fiona's expression had gone completely blank, unreadable. Then the kitchen door opened, and Willie Lamont stepped inside, followed by a woman Hamish didn't immediately recognise. She was elderly, small, wearing a tweed coat that had seen better days. Her eyes were bright and sharp as a bird's. "This is Mrs. Euphemia Grant," said Willie. "She lives in the cottage behind the school, and she has something to tell you." The old woman nodded to Hamish. "I heard you were investigating those bones, and I heard about poor Robert and Angus, and I decided I couldn't keep quiet any more, not after 2 more deaths." "Keep quiet about what?" said Fiona, her voice sharp. "About what I saw 30 years ago, dear. the night that girl died. Mrs. Grant settled herself into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protest the cold. I couldn't sleep that night, had a terrible headache. So I went for a walk, thought the air might help, and I walked down toward the peat ground, where it's quiet. What did you see? Said Hamish. I saw Katrina Drummond and Robert Gillies arguing, saw him push her, saw her fall, saw him panic and try to wake her. And then, Mrs. Grant looked directly at Fiona. Then I saw Margaret Macpherson arrive with her daughter, saw Margaret take charge, saw her direct Robert to bury the body. And saw the daughter. You saw you, Fiona, though you were just a girl then, watching it all happen. Fiona had gone very still. I should have gone to the police, Mrs. Grant continued, but I was frightened. Margaret Macpherson was a hard woman, and she'd lost so much already. I told myself it was an accident, that the girl was already dead, that speaking up wouldn't bring her back. So I stayed quiet, and I've regretted it every day since. Why are you speaking now? Said Hamish. Because 2 more people are dead, and because I saw Fiona Kennedy walking toward Angus Moore's croft 2 nights ago, late, when decent people are in their beds. I saw her go in, and I saw her come out an hour later, and the next morning Angus was found hanged. Mrs. Grant's voice was firm. I won't be responsible for another death. I won't stay silent while someone kills to protect a 30-year-old secret. Fiona stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. The testimony of a confused old woman who thinks she saw something in the dark 30 years ago? That's not evidence. You're right, said Hamish. By itself it's not enough. But combined with everything else, the phone records will trace, the forensic evidence from Angus's house that will show you were there, the pattern of behaviour, it's more than sufficient to arrest you and build a case. He stood as well, reaching for his handcuffs with the calm certainty of a man who has finally solved a puzzle that has been troubling him. Fiona Kennedy, he said, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Robert Gillies and the murder of Angus Moore. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be noted and may be given in evidence. For a moment he thought she might run. Her eyes darted to the door, calculating distances and possibilities. Then her shoulders sagged and something went out of her. Not quite defeat, but a recognition that the game was over. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said quietly. It was just supposed to stay buried. Things rarely do, said Hamish, clicking the handcuffs into place. Not in the Highlands, not in Lochdoub. Here, the earth gives up its secrets eventually, whether we want it to or not. He led her out to the Land Rover while Willie called Strathbane to arrange transport. Mrs. Grant remained in the kitchen, accepted tea from Willie, and looked out the window at the grey afternoon with the satisfied expression of someone who has finally unburdened their conscience. The fog was rolling in off the loch again, threading through the village like searching fingers. But for once, Hamish reflected, Lochdoub's secrets were coming into the light rather than hiding in the mist. It was about time. Chapter 10. The Face. Everyone trusted. The trial of Fiona Kennedy took place the following spring in Inverness, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and furniture polish and the accumulated weight of Scottish justice. Hamish attended every day of the proceedings, partly out of duty and partly out of a sense that he owed it to Katrina Drummond to see the thing through to its end. The prosecution's case was thorough and damning. Phone records traced the burner mobile that had called Robert Gillies on the night of his death to a shop in Fort William, where Fiona had been recorded on CCTV making the purchase. Forensic evidence placed her at Angus Moore's croft on the night of his death. Fibres from her coat found on his furniture, her fingerprints on the rope that had been used to hang him, and Mrs. Euphemia Grant gave her testimony with a clarity and conviction that left no room for doubt. Fiona's defence argued that she had been a traumatised teenager, that her mother had coerced her into silence, that the weight of carrying the secret had driven her to desperate action. They painted her as a victim of circumstances, a fundamentally good woman who had been forced into terrible choices by the sins of others. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found her guilty on both counts of murder. The judge, a stern woman with grey hair and no apparent tolerance for sentiment, sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. As she was led from the dock, Fiona looked directly at Hamish. Her expression was neither defiant nor apologetic. It was simply empty, as though something essential had been hollowed out and nothing remained but the shell. Afterward, Hamish stood outside the courthouse in the spring sunshine and felt nothing in particular. Not satisfaction, not triumph, Not even the relief of a job well done. Just a quiet sadness for all the lives that had been bent and broken by a chain of events that had started with greed and ended with murder 30 years later. "You look like a man in need of a drink," said a voice beside him. He turned to find Detective Inspector Blair, looking unusually subdued in a dark suit that might actually have been pressed for the occasion. "I don't drink on duty," said Hamish. "Neither do I, officially. But I'm making an exception today, and so should you." Blair gestured toward a pub across the street. "Come on, I'm buying, which should tell you how serious I am." They sat in a corner booth with whiskey that Blair ordered, and Hamish accepted more out of surprise than desire. For a few minutes neither of them spoke, content to let the noise of the pub fill the silence. "You did good work," said Blair eventually. "Better than I would have done, if I'm being honest. Which I'm not usually inclined to be, but the whiskey makes me maudlin." "Thank you," said Hamish, unsure what else to say. "The thing about small places," Blair continued, "is that everyone thinks they know everyone. But they don't, do they? They know the faces people show them, the masks, not what's underneath." He took a drink. "Fiona Kennedy taught children, smiled at parents, helped with school plays, and all the while she was capable of bashing a man's head in and staging an old man's suicide. How does that work exactly?" "People are complicated," said Hamish. "They contain multitudes, as the poet said. Most of the time the good parts win out. Sometimes they don't. Depressing way of looking at it. Realistic way of looking at it." Blair finished his whiskey and stood. "Well, try not to solve any more murders for a while. You're making the rest of us look bad." He clapped Hamish on the shoulder and left, weaving slightly as he went. Hamish sat alone for a while longer, then drove back to Lochdoub through the lengthening afternoon. The landscape was green with spring growth, the hills softened by new grass and the loch sparkling under clear sky. It was the sort of day that made you glad to be alive and in the Highlands, where the beauty could break your heart if you let it. Lochdoub itself had settled back into its ordinary rhythms with the particular resilience of small places that have weathered scandal. The hotel had new owners now, a young couple from Edinburgh who were full of plans for renovations and organic menus. The wool shop had closed temporarily, while Morag Finlayson took a holiday in Skye to settle her nerves. The primary school had brought in a supply teacher, a cheerful woman from Strathbane who was rumoured to be far less strict than Mrs. Kennedy had been. And at Score Moor, where the bones had first been discovered, someone had placed a small wooden cross with Katrina's name carved into it. Hamish didn't know who had done it, but he suspected it was Jessie Crawford from the post office, who had always had a sentimental streak beneath her sharp tongue. He stopped there on his way back to the police station, stood for a moment looking at the cross and the scarred earth, where 3 decades of secrets had finally been exposed to light. The peat ground would heal eventually, grass would grow over the exposed bank, heather would bloom, and in time it would look as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But Hamish would know, the village would know, and perhaps that was enough. "Rest now," he said quietly to the earth and whoever might be listening. "It's over." Back at the police station, Lugs greeted him with the wild enthusiasm of a dog who had been alone for at least 48 hours by his reckoning, despite it having been less than a day. Hamish made them both dinner, sat at his kitchen table with the dog at his feet, and tried not to think too much about what had been lost and what had been gained. The telephone rang. It was Willie, wanting to know if Hamish would be at the Napoli that evening for the quiz night. Hamish said he would, because life went on, and one had to participate in it, or risk becoming a hermit, which was always a danger in the Highlands where solitude was abundant and human connection required effort. Later, walking to the restaurant through the soft spring evening, he thought about Katrina Drummond, who had been 22 and clever and brave, who had seen something wrong and decided to do something about it, even knowing it might cost her, who had trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment and paid for it with her life. Her mother had died without knowing what happened, which was perhaps the cruelest part of the whole tragedy. But at least now there was certainty. At least now the truth had been spoken and justice, such as it was, had been done. The Napoli was warm and loud with conversation and the smell of garlic and tomatoes. Willie had saved him a seat at the bar. The quiz questions were absurd. What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? And the teams argued good-naturedly over answers that no one actually knew. Hamish sipped his beer and half listened and felt the normal, ordinary life of Lochdoub flowing around him like water around a stone. This was what he'd stayed for, all these years. This was what he'd given up promotion and career advancement and the chance to live in cities with proper restaurants and indoor plumbing that worked consistently. The rhythm of it, the familiarity, the sense of being woven into the fabric of a place so completely that you became part of its story, even when the stories were dark ones, even when they ended badly. "You're brooding," said Willie, refilling his glass without being asked. "Stop it. You did your job. You found the killer. You can't save everyone, and you can't undo what's already done." "I know," said Hamish. "Do you? Because you've got that look, the one that says you're taking responsibility for things that aren't your fault." "It's my natural expression." "Then get a new one. It's depressing." Willie moved away to serve another customer, leaving Hamish alone with his thoughts and his beer. Outside, the fog was rolling in off the loch again. It crept through the streets of Lochdu, softening the edges of buildings and wrapping the village in its familiar grey embrace. Hamish watched it through the window and thought about how appropriate it was. This constant presence of mist and cloud and things half seen. The Highlands kept their secrets even when they'd been exposed. They made you work for clarity, and even when you achieved it, there was always something just beyond the edge of visibility, something you couldn't quite make out. But that was all right. That was part of living here, part of understanding that not everything could be known or solved or tidied away. Some mysteries remained mysterious, some questions had no good answers, and some tragedies simply were, without lesson or meaning or redemption. All you could do was bear witness, remember, and try to do better next time. Hamish finished his beer, said goodnight to Willie, and walked home through the fog. Luggs was waiting at the door, having somehow sensed his approach, despite the fact that Hamish had been gone less than 2 hours. They went inside together, into the warmth and light of the police station kitchen, and Hamish locked the door behind them. Outside, Lochdu settled into sleep. The loch murmured against the shore, the wind moved through the heather on the hills, and somewhere in the darkness, the land that had held Katrina Drummond's bones for 30 years continued its slow work of healing, covering over the scars, growing new things in the places where old things had died. In the morning there would be other problems, other concerns, other small dramas and emergencies that made up the daily work of a Highland constable. There would be lost sheep and domestic disputes and tourists asking for directions to castles that didn't exist. Life would continue in all its messy, complicated, beautiful ordinariness. But tonight Hamish Macbeth sat in his kitchen with his dog at his feet and his village sleeping around him, and he thought about a young woman who had wanted justice and had died for it, and about how the truth, once buried, had a way of working itself free no matter how much time passed or how many people tried to keep it hidden. The fog pressed against the windows, the fire crackled in the stove, and Lochdu, having given up its secrets at last, kept its peace a little more honestly than before. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even closure, really. But it was something. And sometimes, Hamish reflected, something was enough. He made himself tea, gave Luggs a biscuit, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it whatever troubles and mysteries the Highlands had decided to send his way. For tonight, the dead had been remembered. The guilty had been caught, and a village constable who had never wanted promotion or glory or anything more than to live quietly in the place he loved had done his job one more time. It would have to be enough, and somehow, as the fog wrapped Lochdu in its ancient embrace and the night deepened toward morning, it was.